Graphing sine waves is what we're going to take a look at here. So if I just try graphing y equals sine of x, a couple things I need to realize about this graph. First of all, it's going to start off at 0, 0. It's going to end at 2 pi. So by the time it gets to 2 pi, it's done one full cycle. So the period of sine of x is 2 pi. Which means that in that amount of time, it went up, it went back down, crossed the midline, it went to its lowest point, and got back to 2 pi. So right in the middle of those 2 points, I have another point. That's on the midline, and that's where it crosses the midline again. Now, in between these 2 points here is where it's going to meet its highest point. So halfway between there, it's going to be its highest point. Its highest point is going to be a 1 because the amplitude is 1. Halfway between these 2 points, it's going to be its lowest point. So right there. Now if I just draw a smooth curve through that, that is one cycle. Now how this graph changes based on any alterations we make to the equation. So if I go through and subtract away a pi over 2, let's say, if it's inside the parentheses, that means it is now my h value. What this does to my graph now is instead of it being right here, it actually now just gets shifted pi over 2 units to the right. That is now the graph. Everything else stays the exact same. If we take a look at a different value, let's say I add 1 to it, that is not inside of a set of parentheses. The parentheses would be right here. So that is no longer an h value, that is now a k value. That switches my midline. My midline now is going to be at a positive 1, so my graph moves up positive 1. And the graph looks like that. Some of the other differences that can happen is I could get an a value in here. My a value would be located right here. So if I put in an a value of 2, all that's going to do now, it's going to change my amplitude. My amplitude brought me up to this point here and down to this point here. So my amplitude is now 2. So instead of going up 1, it's going to go up 2 units to here, and it's going to go down 2 units to here. The period stays the same, therefore the graph still does a full cycle in 2 pi, and the graph changes just like that. The next value we can switch here is our b value, the number that multiplies the x. So if I put a 2 here, so sine of 2x, what that means is that by the time it goes through the full 2 pi, it's going to do 2 full cycles. So the symmetry I talked about earlier with this red graph is going to still hold in place. Everything's just going to be crunched a little bit. So by the time it gets here, it's going to make the full cycle of up, back to midline, down, back to midline. Therefore, the halfway point is where it's going to cross the midline. Halfway between there is where it's going to reach its highest point. And halfway between the other 2 points here is where it's going to reach its lowest point. There's one full cycle in pi. If I wanted to repeat it and draw a second one. And there's my 2 full cycles in 2 pi. Now putting all this together gives us something like this. Y equals 2 sine of 4 times x minus pi over 2 minus 1. we need to take a look at all these separate pieces individually to help us break this down. My midline now is at -1. So there's my midline. My amplitude is 2, which means I'm going to go 2 above that and 2 below my midline. It's going to touch those 2 points there. I know that it's going to have a starting point on my midline at a positive pi/2. So my starting point will be here. And the last thing I'm going to take a look at is this value here. That means within the time it does 2 pi, it's going to have 4 cycles. Now, since I have been moved to the right pi/2, that means its ending point is going to be moved over as well. So between those 2 points is 2 pi. Now, it's going to do 4 cycles in there. So if I cut that in half, it's going to do 2 cycles by that point. And right here, it's going to do 1 full cycle. So by the time it gets to this point right here, it will have completed a whole cycle. So thinking of the symmetry of the sine graph, halfway between means it's going to be back at the midline. Halfway between those points, it'll be at the top, and halfway between the other 2 points will be at the bottom. That is 1 full cycle. So the graph will look like that. If I want to make more full cycles, I can always break them in half again. And continue that as far as I would like. So using that information, we should be able to graph any sinusoidal graph.